Plan your beats based on what's revealed instead of what happened. A beat is an interaction that advances the plot. It's considered to be the smallest unit. So it's the smallest thing that advances the plot forward. This tip is that instead of describing the whole situation around what happened, you get to, what actually advanced the plot forward. The reason to do this is because it keeps you focused as the writer on what's the most important and not so distracted by the situational information, which doesn't advance the plot. So I'll start with a little bit of introduction of myself. I'm Michael Green. I'm a writer, a data scientist, and the founder of Lynit, a tool to help writers wrangle their ideas into a well-structured story. The app started really as a passion project for me. I was writing my first book, like 500 pages, tons of characters, tons of arcs, different themes I wanted to cover. And I needed something to really help me get a grasp really of the story, to understand the structure. And I created Lynit just for me. And I showed it to a couple of writer friends just to talk about the craft. And they were so excited that they convinced me to just put it online. I was like, okay, I'll put it online and see if, it helps other writers too. And then pretty quickly after it went up, a reporter from BBC discovered it and then profiled me and the company. And then that sort of like shot Lynit into becoming a real thing other than just a passion project. And so that was like more than a year ago now, but now it's been working on Lynit full time, helping writers, improve their craft. And some of the techniques really that I've learned in my personal process, but also in terms of how in the creation of the tool, thinking about outlining in a more abstract way, sharing some of those sort of tools and tips that I've learned over that. So that's what we're going to see here in this workshop. So first, I want to cover the learning objectives. So first portion is going to be craft tips to improve your outlining. So to help you hone your outline to the core parts, create believable characters, structure dynamic scenes. And then the second section is a deeper understanding of the logistical mechanics of the outlining process, which sounds like a mouthful, but we're really going to break down sort of logistically what needs to take place for you to outline appropriately and effectively. And through doing that, we'll discover some ways to, waste less time while you're editing, and to help you spot some issues that may exist in your current outlining process. So first, let's start with defining, what is outlining, in the creative process. Right. It is often considered to be all the steps that you do right before you start writing. But it isn't something that you do once and then you're done with it. Right. It's part of the iterative creative process. And I break it down into 3 phases. So the first phase is your ideas, your creativity, all the notes that you take, as you're going for a walk through the park, you're, getting ideas for your story while you're sitting at the dinner table. And that's just really just the creative ideas of like, what could possibly be in your story? There may not be any structure there yet, but you're just thinking of things that you want to happen in your story, or things that excite you. Second is the actual outline document itself. Now, this is when you put structure to all those ideas. Okay, you need a beginning, middle, and end. I need this character to have multiple levels of, motivation. And you start adding, the structure to these ideas you have. And then thirdly, it's actually the written text itself. It's not always that all your ideas and the structure comes to you when you're in a separate stage, but actually while you're writing the story, you may get new ideas for a twist that happens in the moment. And in that moment, you change a part of your story, and that's only captured in the written text itself, right? It may not be in your outline at that moment. And so outlining is really how well you go between these 3 stages. If you purely, when you get a new idea on the fly, you update the text and keep going, your outline will fall out of sync, and then you don't really have anything to capture your structure. It's only the written text, right? Which could be a really long document, 300 pages or more. And so so your ability to outline effectively is how well you can keep these things sort of like in communication. And so this is really, the theory of the process that, this is pretty organized, going from ideas to outline to text, back to new ideas to updating your outline. But in reality, we can see that it's, anyone who's trying to write anything knows that it's this chaotic process. But, in terms of process and tooling, Lynit was created with these three phases in mind. So it was really keeping track of, okay, there's a lot of needs in terms of how you structure your story specifically, but not losing track of this process, right? That it's not that you're going to produce some document one day and then you're done with it and you never come back to it, but that you'll be iterating over it as you write, as new ideas come to you, and that these things need to all work together effectively. And then we're going to talk about really that process part, throughout this as well. But to begin, we're going to focus just on the outline piece itself. So the actual document that you're going to create that contains a structure of your story. We're going to focus there for this first portion. And so there are three main components to the outline. First is the story elements. So these are the individual components, the pieces of your story. So you may have your characters, your different arcs, your themes, the setting, motifs, all the different independent pieces that you may describe in like individual document just to capture what they are. What are the things that's going to happen in the arc? What do you want to say with your theme? What's in terms of world building? How does the world work? How does the government and society function together? Second are the connections. So these are the relationships between the story elements. So intuitively, we often do these, think of the relationships between two characters, how do they know each other? How do they support each other? What's their, effects on each other? But more abstractly, how does your story elements, your theme show up in your characters, right? How does your setting, reveal something about the plot or some aspect of a character's personality? So really thinking about how the different parts of your story sort of relate to each other and inform how they show up in your story. And then thirdly is the actual scene planning, where you're taking all the information you may have about your characters, your arc, your events, your themes, what the relationship to each other, and then organizing it into your scenes, as the order that the reader would experience the story, and trying to have those be as dynamic and interesting as possible. So we're going to breeze through each of the areas so we can at least cover something in each of them in this short hour. So as a sort of backdrop, we're going to think of everyone's familiar with the tortoise and the hare story. But so we're going to imagine that we wanted to take that story and rewrite it, right? Focusing on the fox. This image is one of the original images of the story. And I sort of felt inspired that the fox was in such bright color in the background. He seemed to be maybe scheming something. So what if instead we decide that the tortoise and hare story is really about the fox, and the fox is the one who set up the race, right? Because he's a gambler and he wanted to bet on this. So he made sure to, to tell the tortoise to challenge the hare to a race. So we're going to just use that as a sort of a backdrop for talking about different aspects of outline and structure. So first, we're going to start with character. So the first concept here is similar to something we mentioned before, describing that that connections are a part of the outline, but to define your characters through their connections. And so what does that mean? So instead of saying that you have two characters who are friends, right, and you could describe their relationship, right, is to really think about how that friendship affects the two characters, right? How is this character, how is one character who they are because of their friendship with another person, and focus on describing that relationship and how that the character is defined through that, right? And so similarly, not only to character relationships, but to other elements of the story, right? So how is, the character defined in terms of a theme in your story? How are they defined in terms of piece of the setting, right? They may have grown up in that world, they're from a particular city, they grew up on a spaceship. How does that setting piece, what is their relationship to that? And how does that define that character, the way they think, the way they move through the world? And to focus on defining the character through that. And the benefit of doing that is that it quickly helps you abstract out some of the larger ideas of your story. That, it's very easy to, in a single, let's say, document, you could describe a character and describe, what their fears are and, who their best friend is and what, major event in their backstory affected them, or, quirks of their personality. And you can, those are important things to capture. But often they're larger concepts that you're tapping into when you describe that individual character. And so it's valuable to just start with pulling those out, right? And describing them in terms of a relationship to something. Because once you do that, then you can describe the other parts of your story, other characters, or other parts in terms of those same other concepts, right? So make sure if I'm describing a character in terms of a theme, or in terms of a setting, for example, I am keeping track of how I describe other characters in terms of that setting, right? If, let's say they grew up in space on a spaceship, that can have different effects on different characters. And I can describe those differently. And I can be able to keep track of that because it's all centered around that setting, versus if I describe them purely in the individual character templates or documents, it'll be harder to keep track of, am I consistently representing sort of that setting and how that setting affects the people of the world? And secondly, it helps you to actually shorten the character document that you may have, which may be really, really long. It helps you to shorten it down to the core pieces about how their different connections sort of coincide in them and create them uniquely, right? How do they combine to describe this character? So we're going to jump into the outline of the tortoise and hare story, and we're going to take a look at the fox in this, and we'll think about that. So I'm switching over to Lynit itself. If you're familiar with Lynit already, you're going to see some new things here because this is a new version of Lynit that's coming out really soon. So you can get a sneak peek here. If you're not familiar with Lynit, then this is just, I can explain in detail sort of what's happening. So on the left side, this is the element list. So these are the different elements in the story. So we have the arcs, the characters, the events, the themes that are taking place in the story. Here in the center, for now, we're in the element of, the arc, the tortoise peaceful walks. That's the main arc of the story. But actually, we're going to switch to the fox because we should be there. So we're going to dive into the fox. And so this is just a visualization of the timeline of the fox's beats. But actually, what popped out on the right side, these are the connections that the fox has to different elements. And I'm going to switch to the visualization so that we can actually see the connection. The other view was just the timeline of sort of the beats that are evolving for the fox, but this view is focusing on the connection, the relationships. So we can see a visualization of the relationships of the fox, just to have a sense of what are the things it's related to, what is he defined by. But here we can, see the descriptions of those relationships. So for example, the story, the tortoise and the hare, the main theme of that story is, slow and steady wins the race, right? That's the whole lesson they want you to learn. And so, we're adding the fox into this story. So they need to be described in terms of that theme, because that's the main theme of the story. So, I created a fox here, and, his sort of relationship to that concept, to that theme is that, he's a gambler, and he thinks that there's a quick fix to his big problems. He wants a shortcut to wealth. So it's just capturing the idea of sort of how he relates to that and defining him in terms of it. Here on the left is the element of the fox, and you can see, we have all these separate statements that describe the fox, right? But actually I can remove most of these, pretty much, I think all of these, and just leave the connections to just describe them in terms of those relationships, right? I could say here the fox is friends with the hare. I could describe it there. But if I capture it in terms of the relationship here, the benefit is that, if I want to look at the other element, so let's take a look at the slow and steady. That's a theme in the story. So the slow and steady theme, I'm going to go to deep mode of that. So now we're seeing the story from this element's point of view. Now I can see how all the different elements are relating to this theme. So if later while I'm writing, halfway through the story, I start adjusting the theme, what I want to say about slow and steady wins the race, it's very easy for me to find how this shows up in the story, right? I can find, for the fox, he thinks that there's a quick fix, there's big problems. I can see how it's showing up for the tortoise. Tortoise is just someone who embodies, someone takes their time. The hare is someone who's always in a hurry. Even the major events of the story, the fact that there's a race, like the race just reveals a theme, right? This whole purpose of it. But I can quickly get to this higher level structural view of the story because I was conscious of describing my characters and by not just describing them, but defining them in terms of these other elements, so that if I later need to, get a quick review of some higher level structure part, I can find it more easily. Any questions or comments on this part so far? All right, we'll keep going. So next is we're switching to arcs to plan your beats based on what's revealed instead of what happened. So a beat, well, firstly, if you're not sure what a beat is an interaction that advances the plot. It's considered to be the smallest unit. So it's the smallest thing that advances the plot forward. And so with this tip is that instead of describing the whole situation around what happened, right, which even, for myself, I can find that I can be guilty of, describing, the character walked into the room, they saw something else. You're describing what's happening in the space. And then you get to, what actually advanced the plot forward, them arriving there may not have, advanced the plot forward, them discovering that their parent is, dead or something, that's advancing the plot forward. Everything leading up to it doesn't. So to focus on that, and the reason to do this is because it keeps you focused as the writer on what's the most important, and not so distracted by the situational information, which doesn't advance the plot. It's a tool in order for you to convey the beat itself, right, what is revealed, but it isn't from a structural standpoint valuable to you to make sure your structure of your story is sort of sound. So I found in my own work and even in others that you can get lost in thinking that, the plot is advancing because you have situational things happening. But it takes a bit more a careful eye to pay attention to find out what is revealed in here, right? What is pushing the story forward? What's new information revealed? What new problem is being presented? And so before we actually, no, we're just going to jump straight into the outline and take a look at some of the beats we have and really look at, what's the most important information there. So we're going to look at the main the main arc of the story, which is the tortoise peaceful walks. So I'm going to zoom in on the left side here, so it's a bit easier for you to read. But so we have 3 beats to describe basically what happens in the tortoise and the hare story, the main plot. So I'm going to read through these, but I want you to be thinking as I go through all of them, like, what's the critical information? Is this, is this a statement that's actually pushing the plot forward? And then we'll come back through and sort of, dissect these. So all the animals are leaving their house in the morning. The hare teases the tortoise on his way to work because he moves slowly. The tortoise challenges the hare to a race. The next beat, the race between the hare and the tortoise begins. The hare starts out fast while the tortoise is moving slowly. It looks like the hare is going to win. The third beat, the hare takes a nap because he is overconfident, then loses the race to the tortoise. All the other animals are surprised. So let's take a look back to the first beat. So this first sentence, all the animals are leaving their houses in the morning. That's just situational information. Well, if we can recheck the plot question of this tortoise peaceful walks arc is, will the tortoise be able to walk to work in peace? Because, he's being teased every day. So, all the animals are leaving the houses in the morning. That isn't advancing the plot, right? That's not something structural to the story that you need to make sure is there. So we can actually remove that. That doesn't add anything in terms of the plot, right? You need that for like situational to have a story, but in terms of the structure, you don't need it. The second sentence, the hare teases the tortoise on his way to work because he moves slowly. Now that's a beat, right? That's something that's revealed. That's beginning to show that there's conflict, right, in the story. So just introducing it. So that is a beat. And then this second sentence, the tortoise challenges the hare to a race. There's actually a separate beat. That's a separate thing that's revealed. So I'm actually going to pull that out and put it as its own beat. So I'm just going to add a new beat. And then drag this underneath because this is really just a separate beat. Then this beat here. Now, the race between the hare and the tortoise begins. Did my computer freeze? I hope it looks like it did. Okay. But if I think it's fine. So the second beat, or now the third beat, the race between the hare and the tortoise begins. So this is a beat in disguise, right? It seems like this pushes the story forward because, the tortoise challenges the hare to a race, therefore the race has to begin. But you didn't actually receive any new information that makes you closer or further from knowing, like, when the tortoise challenges the hare to the race. The question is the tortoise going to win or lose at that point? So you're not any closer to answering that. So that sentence doesn't add anything. And actually the same for the 2 other sentences after that. So the hare starts out fast while the tortoise is moving slowly. It looks like the hare is going to win. None of that actually adds anything from a structural standpoint to the plot, because all of that is expected from the previous beat, right? When the tortoise challenges the hare to a race, it's expected that they're going to have the race. It's expected that the hare is going to start out fast while the tortoise is moving slowly. And it's expected that it's at least going to look like the hare is going to win, because that was already sort of set up before then. So that whole beat is not really a beat because it's not advancing the plot. And this particular sort of situation, the metaphor I like to think of is if the story was, I'm going to roll a boulder down a hill, it's not advancing the plot if I tell you that the boulder is at 25% away down the hill, is at 50% away down the hill, is at 75% away down the hill, because you already, if you know gravity, you expected that it's not adding any tension. You're, unless there was, more complexity where, there's a time crunch and there are people trying to get out the way, And then but I have to let you know that other information. It's not just that the boulder is getting closer. It's the people at the bottom are trying to run or whatever, and they're having struggles to get out the way. That would advance the story, but not just the fact that the boulder is falling down the hill, because you would guess that that was going to happen. So you don't experience any actual story momentum from seeing exactly what you expected to happen with no hiccups, right? Doesn't give you any momentum. That's like leading you to sort of the next problem. So we can actually delete that completely. And this is, depending on, ways to interpret this we get from readers, right? When they feel like stuff is happening, they feel like they read a lot of stuff, but they're like, nothing happened, or they feel like it was a very long, let's say, chapter. And, there's one thing at the end they found out because, there were these sort of fake beats in between that weren't really advancing anything. And, there was just a lot of text around something. So this is really something to be mindful of in your work, because this is something, in terms of the pacing of it, in terms of readers actually feeling like they're advancing, this is a really strong culprit. So we're going to delete that. And then third, so let's go to now the third beat. So the hare takes a nap because he's overconfident, then loses the race to the tortoise. So actually that first statement is a beat on its own. The hare takes a nap because he's overconfident. That adds something new to the plot. Now you don't know if the hare is going to win as you expected, because he took this nap because he's overconfident. So let's pull that out. Then he loses the race. That's a separate thing, a separate beat. I'm just going to pull that out as a beat. I'll just say the hare. Oh no, this is actually fine where it is. And then we have this remaining sentence from up here, so all the animals are surprised. That's not really a beat, doesn't advance the plot. That's just situation information of the characters. They're responding to what had happened, which is the hare losing, so we don't really need that. So now we've adjusted this to 4 typed beats. And getting down to these, really refined beats where it captures like what is revealed and who revealed it, it actually frees you up to not feel so confined to the ordering that you had before, right? Because the ordering you may have had before is so situationally construed, right, that you can't, reorder some things because you're like, well, first the race begins, and then I can't reorder because of this situational concept. But from a structural component, we could rearrange some of these things, like, for example, or free ourselves to change the story a little bit. For example, the hare takes a nap because he's overconfident. Now, you could be particular and break that out into 2 different beats, because one could be revealing that the hare is overconfident, right? That can be important information that you need for the plot. So you can pull that out as its own beat and put that earlier, right? We could pull that out and say, actually, we want to separate out this information. We'll tell you that he's overconfident from the beginning, right? Before the race starts, right? And this would change sort of the feeling of the story. If you already know that the hare is overconfident, then you already suspect that he will lose, right? Or you're expecting that to come into play, right? Versus with the current order, you don't really, it's a surprise when you find out the hare takes a nap, right? You're not looking for that moment. But that's a structural thing, depending on the type of story you want to tell. But when you reduce it down to these beats, you're able to focus more on what's revealed, and you can play with that a bit more in the ordering of it, in the way that can increase the tension, right? Because I would argue that if you reveal that the hare is overconfident earlier, that would give you more tension when you're watching that situational part of the race beginning, the hare starting out fast, like The way it was, there'll be no tension there. You'll just be watching it, you're expecting it. But if I tell you that the hair is overconfident, then there may be tension because you're like, oh, well, maybe that character flaw is going to come up. So, but yeah, so getting down to these makes it easier to, focus on what's most important. And actually, and I'll just note too, I think maybe something we were talking about earlier, Emma, that this is the area where, if there's lots of information that you need to convey to a reader, like I write fantasy, so I always have tons of information about the world that I need to convey. I have to find ways to put a beat with that information. If I'm not able to have a beat attached to the information, then to the reader, the experience is information dump, right? They're just going to feel that you're explaining something and they don't care about it at that moment, right? It might be useful later, but in that moment, they're not particularly caring about all that information because it's not advancing the plot for them, right? It's not getting them closer to understanding, whatever the plot question is or whatever they want to know about a character's development. So to really get that there, but we're going to actually come back to world building or setting information that you need to get out as well. But it also comes down to really the beats that you really want to make sure that your beats can also, any information you're trying to convey are attached to a beat. Any questions or comments on on the arcs and the revealing versus describing what happened? Awesome. I'll keep going. So next is setting. And so here, so to treat your world building like it's a character. So what do I mean by that? So if we can remember back to 2 slides ago, well, first, even with character, it's describing it in terms of its relationship to other things, right? So even in your setting, the setting is just one component of the story, but you can define it in terms of, how it shows up in your characters, how the setting relates to themes that you want to cover. How does the setting relate to the plot, right? If you're writing, let's say, fantasy, sci-fi, or dystopian in some different world, and the setting doesn't have a strong relationship to the plot, now that's possible, you can have that. But, it can be, if you, depending on the type of story you want to study, you can be mindful of, is my setting really making the plot more interesting or relevant, or is it just a backdrop where it has nothing to do with what's going on, which that could be the, the purpose of your story. But if if that isn't, to be mindful of that when you're doing your setting. And secondly, similar with the character, you have to define a character's beats, right? Of how a character develops over time, how they grow, they learn, or for a main character, what is their development? So to do the same thing for your world building, but in terms of making sure you space out like beats the information that a reader needs to know in order to make sense of the plot, right? So breaking it up into beats can make it easier for you to track if, for example, in a single scene, you have 10 beats related to world building. That might be too much information at one time for a reader to take in, even if it's all like related to plot, right? It's going to explain away, you'll make you understand everything that happens, but that may be too much in a single, scene. So planning it as beats can help you keep track of like how much really information that you're trying to dump onto the reader, right? There's plot things that they need to understand and follow. There's world building things that they need to understand and follow. And so doing this, it can help you separate out the two types of setting information. The setting information that is critical for defining the plot, for explaining the plot, so that you understand what's happening. And then there's setting information that's just for like mood, right? For the reader to feel like they're in the 1950s, right? You may have, descriptions about, I don't know, the classic telephone or, the old telephone hook, or you may have other details in there about the type of food people are eating or the type of music that's playing, they're listening to in the dance. That's important for creating the setting and being there, but most of that may not be important to explaining the plot, right? And so it can help you focus on tracking separately, through beats, which specific information do I need, right? If you're talking about 1950s and depending on the plot, you may talk about like, what were the gender roles and expectations of that time, right? That may be affecting your characters. What was the technology, things they had access to, because that may affect, explain, what they do later. And those can be beats, right? And so you can be tracking separately how you're revealing the setting information that's important to the plot. So let's jump back into Lynit, and in the characters section, I created a character called world building. Now in the, theme settings and motif, that's one grouping. I do have setting information like for the tortoise and hares, like the early 1900s. There's talking animals, that's an important setting part to understand. For the fox, I said there's like, he's from the other side of town because he's a gambler. So he's, showing you that there's a darker side to these animals. So it's a different setting that he could, introduce you to. But I create a character called world building. And this is where I track the specific information that I need to convey. So we're going to dive deep into this character, which is going to filter the app to this character's point of view. And so, I have the different setting pieces connected to the world building. So I can use it as a way to ground me into, what aspects of those do I need to convey in order to explain the plot, right? So I can describe those relationships. And then in the actual world building element itself, I have some beats around the important information that is relevant to the plot. So I may say, there are no cars or horses used for transportation. That's important. That's maybe why they're racing. I know. The animals talk and live like humans. There's a dark side to the animals on the other side of town. That's some important world building information that is needed to advance the plot. Now in Lynit, which I forgot to show earlier, but for characters, so also a benefit of setting up as a character is that characters and events can be specified as drivers of beats of the arc, right? So if we go back to this arc, the tortoise peaceful walks, we can actually specify what are the drivers of that beat. So which characters and which events are actually driving that beat, right? So for this first one, we can say that the hare, the hare teases the tortoise on the way to work. The hare is driving that beat. So we can capture that there. And because world building is a character now, I can specify which of these plot beats are being driven by something from our world building character, right? So, there's the world building beat that like they're talking animals, right? They live like humans. That's like important for you to know for this story to make sense. So, I could add the world building as a driver of this beat. And the benefit of doing that in Lynit is that now, let's go back to the world building. So right now, this is the visualization of sort of all the elements and how they relate, but I'm going to switch to the timeline, which is focused on the beats. Now here, we now have two timelines. We have the world building timeline, which belongs to the world building element, but now the tortoise arc shows up in the timeline, And, it has the character icon in the first chapter, because this is saying that we're in the world building element, right? We're in a deep mode of that element, but it's showing us here that this character is driving this arc in some chapter. So in Lynit, it makes it easier to keep track of, what are all the, if you have multiple arcs, right, in your story, subplots and all that, where are all the places that the world building beats are driving the plot. Because there may be moments that you reveal things about the world because it's not driving plot at that moment, but you are explaining it early so that, 4 scenes later, you'll get it. So there may be beats from the world building arc that are placed, right, that don't coincide with the arc beats where it's driving it. But you can also define that here so that you can get that larger picture on where the world building is really affecting your story. So that if you get, feedback from an editor or something about, either they're not understanding, aspects of the world and how it's supporting the actions of the characters or the behaviors of how the arc progresses, coming to this view can actually let you spot places where either you're not driving enough by the world building, meaning you weren't really clear about how the world building is driving it, or you don't have the beats of the world building itself planned out effectively. And this going to this deep mode is not just for world building, like you can, because characters or events can be drivers. So going to deep mode of either of those will show you the other arcs that they're driving. Let's jump to connections. So we have seen connections already, in terms of using it for describing your characters, the value of using it when you're with your setting, and really for all your elements, as I mentioned earlier. But then using that, dropping elements that don't have many connections is a way for you to remove the pieces of your story that aren't really well supported, right? If no other element in your story is really affected by this, is it critical to the story, right? It could be a moment for you to think about, you have a character who is just dangling off, right, from your story structure. It's a moment to say, is this character really driving something? Are they really important to the story? Yes, they may show up a couple of times, but do they represent any of the themes that, that the other elements are, participating in? Is it, really revealing something new about setting or contributing to the plot or other characters' development? So dropping things that don't have many connections. And so actually, as I mentioned, characters, a great way to spot, like, if you have too many ancillary characters who show up is to spot this here. So we're gonna go back to Lynit, and we're gonna exit deep mode and go back to the main dashboard and switch to visualization. So these are all the nodes in the story, the different elements and their relationships. So we have these three elements that are just like floating around, right? They have no connections, the bear, the sheep, the bird. These are characters that, maybe were created on the fly to just they just need to do minor roles to make the plot make sense, right? When they do the race, there might be some other people who witness it. So you created one of these characters just to name them and have them there, they witnessed it. You need someone at the race to like trigger the, fire the gun or something to start. And you need someone at the finish line. And so you may have created these characters in order to fill those roles, but they may not have a lot of other value to the story. And it can be a sign that maybe I can combine them, right? Combine their roles in the story so that I can give so it can be one character who has, maybe 3 connections instead of 3 characters have 1 connection each. And so, maybe in this you could decide, actually we'll just have the bird, right? The bird could be the person who starts the race and then they can fly to the end, and be the person who, sees who wins, so that I don't have to have a different animal there, but really just spotting, things that aren't deeply connected. And like when I first made Lynit, this was like the first, like I had an idea of what I wanted it to do because I created the tool, but my first like feedback to myself that I got about my own story was that in terms of my world building, I had created, in my world, there were 6 forms of magic, and they're important and principal to the place of the plot and all of that. And there's a 7th magic that I created, which was like the old magic from, the before days. And I thought it was really cool to just like for them to have this old magic that they could talk about, so you can know this is like new age magic that they're using now. But once I visualized it, I realized that 7th magic, it just shows up a couple of times. Yes, I thought it was cool, but is it really adding value to the story? If someone remembered that magic over the other 6, which is already a lot, would I be fine with that? And I said to myself, no, I would rather you don't know what that is and remember these 6 versus you remember 5 of them plus one that old magic. And it was just like just the feedback and seeing, the structure of the story helped me to question that, and then I was able to pull it off. But I didn't notice it from just reading my story, and knowing it well. It was easy for me to recognize that was just something that didn't need to be there. And so let's go to scene planning. So now, as I mentioned earlier, when you have the different story elements, you can define your beats independently of each other. And actually something that normally I mentioned, that like if you have a main plot and you have a subplot, right, and you have a character's development, to make sure you outline them independently, even though you're going to put them together later, so that you're sure that they make sense by themselves, right? It's very easy to be focused on the main plot and then sort of just like throw in other stuff that you're like, well, this thing is kind of evolving, but your mentality is focused on the main plot and you're just making sure the character has some development there. But if you were to pull out the character development by itself, it may not make any sense, right? So it's important to define them independently. But when it comes to scene planning, you want to anchor your scenes with your main arc. So what do I mean by that? Your main arc should be in every single scene, some beat from the main arc. If a beat of your main arc is not in that scene, that's a moment for the reader to think, why am I reading the scene? How does this help the main question that I have about this story, right? There can be subplots that have their own things going on, but if the main beat is not advanced, that's just a sign that scene does not work there, right? Then you should find a way to add the main beat, main events there, so that, that scene makes sense. But it doesn't mean that the main arc has to be the most emotionally like charged beat that happens there, right? So, in this little illustration, in chapter, in scene 1, right? The main arc is there, right? Has a beat, but maybe the hare's introduction is being really overconfident and only carrying speed. That can be the most emotionally charged. You can have a whole backstory about why he's in a rush, right? We can learn his wound or something. And that can be the most emotionally charged, but the main arc has to be advanced there, right? Which is like him teasing, I guess, the hare beside the tortoise on his way to work. So definitely always keep that in mind. As we're a bit short on time, I'm just going to pop really quickly to Lynit, but I don't think we have that much time. But so for those who are new to Lynit, and actually even for old people, because this is a new feature, the Beats is new, that's coming out soon. And so I've actually been hiding this feature down here, which is the chapters where you can drag all your beats from your different elements. So you have the ability to, let's look at the fox. You can, outline the fox beats. You can reorder them to figure out, what order makes sense by themselves. Then you can drag them into the chapters, right, as you need it. And so here, to just be mindful that when you're dragging, make sure your main arc is everywhere. And, you can see like in the timeline, for example, our tortoise people walk is not everywhere, right? So that is a structural problem. Unless for the Fox story, it may not become the main plot. I think that the Fox gambling problem would become the new main plot. So then that should be in every chapter, it's all our scene. And you can have the tortoise people walk not advance everywhere. But whatever your main plot is, it should be everywhere. At least one beat in every scene. But you can have multiple beats from the same arc in a single scene, of course, but at least one from the main arc in every scene. Then let's take a step back, right? We just talked about, in these 3 phases of the outlining, the notes, the creativity, and the text, we focus on the outline document itself, how to structure some things, some tips to improve that. Now I want to take a second to talk about the interaction between the notes and the text and the outline, right? Because even if you're, doing your outline as we were going through, all your ideas for what you should be putting in your outline does not always happen when you're in like outline mode, right? When you say, I'm going to sit down and outline. All of them may not come at that moment, right? Even if you're a plotter, right? You plan everything in advance, or most things in advance. When you get into the scene, your characters can still surprise you and throw you for a loop. And so you then have to, work through updating your outline. So we're going to talk a little bit about this process of how we move in between. So we're going to start with just taking a scenario and then thinking about how do we move between the things, right? Between the different areas, the phases. So this first scenario, you plan the book, then halfway through writing it, your character does something that surprises you and you like it. It conflicts with several plot points that you wrote already and will change the flow of the plot after that moment. Now, a very common response I've heard to this type of scenario is that, for some, it disheartens them that stays like, this big change and they don't want to go back, and that may even, scare them out of continuing with that story. They may want to jump to somewhere else. And the other most common is that, people go back and, just update the story because they're excited about this change, and then they keep on going. Now, my suggestion here is more on the logistical part, is that if halfway through you get an idea that makes you want to change what you wrote before, you're likely to get another idea like that later, right? So you may, at 60% of the way, you get a new idea that's like, actually, this is even better, right? 75%, 95%. And those are all great, right? It's great to get those new ideas. But if you go back and you edit those beginning parts, you then have to go back and reread and edit things multiple times to adjust to these ideas. So a more efficient process would be to just note what happened in the past. So, halfway through, I get this new change. I'll drop a note to myself and say, okay, everything before this moment in this chapter, I need to go update in the story or figure it out. But I'm just going to assume that thing happened, right? And just keep going with it. That like I already made the changes for it previously, and I'll just keep writing for it as if, I'd already made the changes. So that even if a change happens at 75%, at 95%, I'm only updating in that one direction, but later I can wait and come back once, right? And taking all those different notes and say, okay, I'll go back to chapter 1. I have 4 or 5 different changes I need to make based on your different ideas. And then you can make that update once, right, to chapter 1, and then go to chapter 2. Instead of if you went back the first time, you would have went back to chapter 1, reread it, edit it to work with that new change that you're excited about. And then maybe 3 months later, when you get that new idea, you'll come back to chapter 1, tweak it some more to work with that new idea. But you just come back and reread the same text, right? In terms of just efficiency, you'll be rereading over it multiple times when you don't really need to. You can come back once and apply 5 changes. Then another quick scenario, you sent your work to a group of beta readers, and over the next 3 months, you receive hundreds of different pieces of feedback, from sentence level correction to suggestions on how to improve your ending. So here, in terms of the logistical approach, it's, thinking about what these different types of feedback mean, right? Firstly, similar concept from the first scenario, wait until you collect a lot of feedback from your beta readers before you make any changes, right? Well, except I would say sentence level corrections, I would make those instantly, because unless I don't have any like personal thing I need to think about, I'm like, oh, oops, I read there versus there, I'll fix that. Or I spelled this wrong, I'll fix that instantly, right? But anything I have to think about, like it takes me more than 1 second to be like, well, then I'll wait. Anything structural. So firstly, do that. So you can come back in one big wave, right? You can see all the different feedback that beta readers have, because often different people can be talking about the same problem they see in your story from different ways, right? And when you collect it and you look at it as a group, it's easier for you to find the common theme between what they were saying and address the problem, right? Because they may just be suggesting just like the way they recognizing and giving you lots of different feedback, which they're just different angles of the thing, and that might not be the way you want to approach it. So to wait until you get a lot, so that you can sort of study them all and figure out what you want to do. And so this is where actually the technology you have for your notes will affect how efficiently you can go through this. If you're able to take all these notes, which you may have in totally different documents because you sent them all, who knows, Word documents or something, and they all put their different notes, or they sent you emails, if you need to be able to take all those notes, put them all in the same notes tool that you can connect to your outline, so that if there's feedback related to a character in the story, right, you can group those together, or there's feedback related to a particular theme, or there's feedback related to, the main arc. But also, some of this feedback may relate to two things, right? Making a feedback from a reader about a character may also affect something about the setting, right? It just makes sense to them how, if they're in a world that's, run by the military, that they would do X, Y, Z, right? That's explaining some of their motivation, some of the things about the setting, and you might need to actually look at those two things and decide, right, how I'm going to affect the setting or the character in order to make, sense of this note. So how well you can connect those things. So I want to jump really quickly to Lynit to show you that that's really what our notes feature is about, right? That you can create a note, like I create this note, I want the fox to have a larger role in the story. So you should come up with the race. That's just an idea I have myself, right? In terms of changing my story, but I can link it, right, to the parts of the story that this relates to, so that I can think about it later, right? Or look at things in conjunction. So I can link it to the fox, and let's say maybe the main plot, because if he's going to be in a story, he needs to affect the Tortoise Peaceful Walks. And so I link the note to those, so that when I later want to make a decision, right, I can just go to the fox, go to deep mode of the fox, and over here in the connections, he's described in terms of this relationship to other parts of the story, but also these notes, these ideas I have about this character, about that I may change them, and I can find that there. So I can have that in context with everything I need. So if you expand this to I have 10 notes about the fox, or 15 about the fox, and like there's some overlap between the fox notes and the plot notes, I can go to that element and pull everything together related to it, and also see the entire outline. So if I need to make decisions on this thing about the fox, well, I'm in the deep mode of the fox, so I can see all the fox's beats, I can see all their connections, I can make sense of this note and take action on it in context of the entire outline. Yeah, so then I just wanted to cover some quick principles for a strong outlining process. Pulling what we can from those two quick scenarios. First is to write text in one direction, right? Always, and it doesn't really matter the order you write, meaning like if you you start with the ending of your story, right? That's the idea you have. You're like, I know the story's going to end. You start there. That's okay. Start with the end and keep writing whatever chapters in whatever order in one direction, right? No matter what ideas you have, only drop notes, right? Don't go back. You start with the last chapter of your book and then you write the second to last chapter, and the second to last chapter, you get a new idea. Don't go back to the last chapter. Just keep going in the direction that you're writing that story in, and notes about the things you've previously written already, and then come back in one big sort of edit sweep so that you just don't waste as much time going back and forth. Second, use a tool that reduces friction, right? If there's friction between you going from your written text to your notes to your outline, then you're going to resist it, right? You'll just leave more in your story, in a written text and rely on your memory. And even though memory is great, when you make 47 edits or changes to your story and there's slight variations because you kept making slight changes, you're going to remember all of those. And then it becomes harder for you to keep track of the absolute story that you want to tell. And that's how often your outline gets very out of sync with what you've written, because it's such a hassle to go back. So a tool that really reduces that friction. And, as I've shown earlier, Lynit is designed for this, right? Where I can actually show you really quickly. We're going to dive deep into a chapter. For people familiar with Lynit, chapters have been moved down here to below the visualization. And so, if I'm writing my chapter here, well, I have access to the beats that are in the chapter. So if I, go left with the plot, I can just, scroll down to the tortoise peaceful walks beat and change. And instead of the hare teasing the tortoise, on his way to work, something else happens. And I can just update the outline right while I'm writing it so that it's not a later task for me to do. Similarly, on the left side, I could, if I want to check or reference anything else in the outline, like if I'm not sure I want to make this change here, and I just want to check on the whole plot of the Tortoise Peaceful Walks, I can pull up the beats and look at them over here so that I can have that information and decide, what I want to do without having it to be, a totally separate situation. And if you're a discovery writer, which I'm more of a discovery writer, you can write some of the scene first and then just start adding the beats as you figure them out, right? Something happens and you're like, oh, okay, I guess I revealed that, the murderer was John. I didn't even know. I just discovered it, create a beat right then and there, and add it to the chapter. So doesn't have to be this later task that you do. And thirdly is to refine a repeatable process for your different writing tasks. So that means to write down and really think about how you handle various scenarios when you're writing, similar to the scenarios we saw. You should know, like the back of your hand, that if you get a major idea halfway through the story, you're not going to go back and edit the text, right? You could look at the outline if you want to think about structurally, do you really like it? Of course, you can do that. If you want to update the outline, you can do that too, because that's a smaller thing for you to update. But are you going to go back to the text and start implementing that? You shouldn't do that in terms of efficiency purposes. And so to really know these things, right? And I feel like it's easy to generate it based on once it happens to you, like the next time some writing situation happened, just note what happened and what you did, and then think about, is this the most efficient way to do it, right? And so you can jot it down and you have it in terms of your steps that work for you. And so that's everything for the workshop. I just wanted to leave you with some takeaway exercises to really apply these lessons to your writing. So first is to take the main arc, of your story in progress or the story you may be planning to write, and rewrite the beats to focus on what's revealed. So just take that one and just eyeing it down to those sentences that's like what's revealed and who revealed it, right? You should be able to get it down to like one sentence, each of the beats. Second is to describe your main character in terms of their connections to other story elements. This is a really great way to if you aren't familiar with this, to really capture what are some of the structural components of your character, right? And how does it relate to other parts of the story? And to get you out of just the focus of sort of how you describe this character, but how do they fit in the overall narrative? And so describing them in terms of their connections. And then thirdly is to write the summary of any chapter, pick one as a combination of the beats, right? So instead of, potentially that your chapter summaries may be describing what happens, right? Even at that level, it has a lot of situational information around it. But to describe your chapter, your summary in terms of the combination of beats, so that when you're rereading your chapter summaries, you're just focusing on the structure, right? You're checking to see, are my beats making sense? And when you do this, you can combine the beats into sentences or like combined sentences that like explain the relationship. So, you could say, he did something and something, beat A and beat B, or beat A despite beat B, right? Even though beat C was taking place, and capturing how they relate to each other into like as dense as possible, right? Paragraph. Because if you can make the beats have relationship to each other, right? There's not just that they're all happening in the chapter, but there's a clear relationship, or at least in that scene or that chapter, how the beats relate to each other. That makes them feel more organic and sort of knitted together, versus you may have the main arc in every scene and you have other arcs happening, but they just seem like unrelated things, right? But if you can make them related in that description as a way to capture it. And then after this, we'll send you an email with actually resharing these exercises to do, and a short survey about the workshop, because we'd love to hear your opinion, and just if there's any feedback on how we can improve. But I want to thank you so much for coming. If you have any questions, you can ask them now, or you can wait for this email, and we'll actually connect you to our Lynit community where we can have follow-up discussion actually about the workshop.